actually one thing I want to do. I just realized I needed to do one last thing before we start. There we go. All right, I think we can get started. Welcome to Mercyhurst for those of you who are not members of our community already, and welcome to this morning's talk for those of you who are members of the community already. We're excited to be hosting this series of Eclipse within our Gate events in advance of today's big show. We'll hope that the clouds move out for the show, right? I want to thank the organizing committee for putting together a really fantastic group of speakers and performers for the events that we held over the weekend and that we'll have throughout the day today. I'm Dr. Will Meyer. I'm Assistant Professor of Anthropology Archaeology in the Department of Anthropology and World Languages here. I'm also the program coordinator for our minor program in Gender Studies. And this morning, I intend to talk to you a little bit about Indigenous science, ancient astronomers, and eclipse prediction in the distant past. And these are subjects that touch on my own research and teaching interests. I'm very interested in how we form relationships both with one another as humans, but also with the more than human world. And then how do we pass those relationships on through generations? And despite the interruptions that might occur as we encounter other cultures or as our own societies encounter crises of various sorts. My goals today are to introduce you to some of the evidence for careful, long-term sky watching by the members of past societies. I also want to suggest that these historical sky watchers were actually astronomers practicing a form of indigenous science. And I want to provide evidence of eclipse prediction in at least one past society. Before we move on, I recognize that some members of the audience might come from cultures where considerations of death and contact with death are to be avoided. I want to warn you that parts of this talk, especially in the next 10 minutes, contain dramatic reenactments of death, contact with the dead, and mourning rituals. I apologize in advance for any discomfort that this might cause. So, I'm going to get your imaginations working a little bit. I want you to imagine that you are not sitting in Erie, Pennsylvania on April 8th in 2024, but instead, I want you to imagine yourself as a Neolithic European. Now, with luck, this will work. This is what happens when you do fancy stuff. Sometimes when you're a professor, your students start to think that you have no technological skills because things like this happen. What's that? Thank you, Dr. Duda. And so when you're a professor, sometimes you have to fall back on plan B. And that's where we'll go today. Please bear with me just a moment. Oh, goodness. I'm going to be signed into everything I own on this computer. Anybody wants to steal my things, this will be the place to do it from. Okay. Let's try this now. There we go. Doo-doo. You were imagining yourself as a Neolithic European. I never, missed the timing here. All right. So, it is 3,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago. It is 3,000 BC. By this point, the pharaohs have united Upper and Lower Egypt and begun their dynasties there. Ancient cities in the Near East have been creating writing and have the wheel, and bronze is starting to spread across Europe. But in Britain, where we live, we're still relying on flake stone tools. Not so much bronze, but we do make these big axes out of stone tools that we use to fell the forests around us. We clear these forests in order to build settlements with posts that have woven brush, and then that brush is covered with clay and plaster. These settlements are able to be quickly moved so that we can follow our herds of cattle, or we can move to live next to our fields of barley and wheat. And in our settlements, we will do things like process that barley and wheat into breads and porridges and maybe even beer. We do things like make baskets, make ceramics of a number of varieties, including this grooved, incised form here. You'll notice, I appreciate your imagining here that we are all quite stylish in the Neolithic. These guys could be my brothers, I suppose. Let's get rid of that. With their nice long hair and their beards. As they continue to... All right, boys, keep going. As they continue to work in the forests, though, both felling trees and gathering and hunting, they would notice the seasonality, right? And as seasons change, so too do the things that we have to do. And so the fall would bring a time when people became very conscious of death. They would have harvested their grain. They would have slaughtered a number of animals, and so you saw these women processing animal skins here. And it might have been a time, we think, when people would be thinking about their own deaths and the deaths of those around them. And so I want you to imagine that after we've done our harvests in October and early November, that we start to gather our dead. People who died earlier in the year were likely cremated. We might cremate those who have died recently. Though if a high-ranking member of our society died, we might take him or her with us, along with a number of our chosen livestock and some of our grain stores, to begin a long, long journey, a kind of pilgrimage, if you will, to celebrate the shortest day and longest night of the year, that which we call the winter solstice, with other people in our society spread out throughout all parts of England. Throughout all parts of Britain, including England and Scotland and Wales. And the place we're going to take our livestock and our dead is today called Durrington Walls. It was a settlement focused around one or a number of timber rings. You can see these houses grouped together. Many of these houses could have held entire families, and there are enough of them that perhaps thousands of people came. While we were here, we might take our honored dead and place them on scaffoldings above the nearby river. But much of our activity is going to be focused on these timber rings. This becomes the site of celebrations and feasting, a place where, though the nights are long, we dance, we eat a lot of food. In fact, we're eating so much food that sometimes we're tossing entire racks of ribs out without gnawing them off the bone, right down to bare bones, right? Because we've got so much surplus that we've brought and our friends have brought. Chances are, if we have made beer from our barley and our wheat, we're drinking it. A lot of hogs and goats and cattle consumed during this time. Like every party, there are a few people who likely stayed up all night, and early in the morning, after the celebration, before the sun comes up, they might have started to move through the community, and you might have heard just a wake-up call moving through the community. And that's trying to get us all to gather after one of the longest nights of the year to prepare ourselves in the wood circle for a critical event. As we get closer, perhaps the drumbeat picks up, and we find ourselves waiting in the pre-dawn darkness for this event. Maybe it's silent, other than the drum. Maybe our spiritual leaders are speaking special words of invocation. But this is the solstice, and one of the most important events to happen is dawn on the shortest day of the year. We all celebrate, right? Thank you for your celebration. Good. Now your celebration is not over. It's not just about dawn. Now the important work of this ritual begins. We come together, we take our containers with the ashes of our loved ones, and we leave Durrington Walls by a complex avenue that leads us down toward the River Avon. And we are going to pass along the river in a southwesterly direction, and along the way, we're going to deposit the cremains of our dead in the river. Those of you familiar with Hindu culture and with Hindu death rituals might recognize here something very similar to what continues to happen even in 2024, that imaginary place in the future, where human remains are placed in the river Ganges and allowed to flow away. And so the river comes to be associated with the passage from life to death. Also for the people who are alive here. They're passing from a place with timber circles, right? A place where there are circles made from a perishable, not so long ago living material. They're going to pass along this river, and their ultimate goal is a place where death reigns, a place where nobody lives. And you can imagine that this was an emotional time for those walking along the path. In fact, for people who had placed a powerful loved one on one of these scaffolds, they likely would have seen that person, and they might have seen that person decaying over a period of seasons until such time as that person's remains might have been collected and taken to this final location. Once down the river, they encounter another avenue, and they start to head northward and a little bit further westward. And they come over a ridge, and they see not a wooden circle, but they see a stone circle. And of course, it's a stone circle that, because we're members of this culture, we all recognize. And at this stone circle, any royal dead, any of our chieftains who have died, will be put in the ground before another vigil, right? Another vigil where the people are saying their prayers in honor of the long dead, those ancestors who have gone before, who might help to oversee the health and fertility of the land, who might help to oversee the health and fertility and continuation of the people. So we're going to sing our chants quietly in this case, but you're imagining them in your head. Perhaps there are drums here again, but certainly we got drums now because this is the sunset on the winter solstice. And everyone celebrates. Celebrators, there we go. Everyone celebrates. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination or that was not expected. This always happens, of course, when you rely on YouTube. Goodbye, YouTube.
Every summer solstice.
You were helpful while you were here. All right. We know from the evidence left behind that, in fact, the celebrations continued at Stonehenge itself. That a number of animal remains demonstrate the same kind of feasting and demonstrate a similar age and sex profile to those found at Durrington Walls. And so we're pretty certain that the season of that celebration was the winter solstice. Now, coming back to the present, what you've just been looking at is a whole landscape. And within anthropology and within archaeology, we have moved largely from talking about sites as isolated places to entire landscapes, looking at how what we used to call sites are related to one another. And so the path that you just traced was from this place up here called Durrington Walls on a bend in the river Avon. And you can see there's another site here called Woodhenge. As it turns out, like most sites, Durrington Walls underwent a series of changes during the times of its use. And so the timber circle was once located within the center of the settlement. At a later period, a deep bank and high ditch were placed around the settlement in a circle, and this is what is actually called the henge, is this bank and ditch structure. And a new timber circle was placed outside. So our imaginary selves moved from Durrington Walls down the river. These pits that you see here seem to evidence the places where the scaffolding for only a few of our members, likely our most elite members, were placed. And so we would have passed them as we went south along the river. And then as we came over here, perhaps after this big meander loop, though I don't know, someone might know, but I don't know if this is a more recent meander loop than in the distant past. But we would have encountered this avenue, this longer avenue that took us up to Stonehenge. Right? And all of this is the theorizing, though quite convincing from an anthropological sense, of an ethnoarchaeologist, a British ethnoarchaeologist named Mike Parker Pearson, who, working with some archaeologists from Madagascar, really noticed these fundamental pairs in the landscape of Stonehenge and Durrington Walls. And for those of you who've taken the history of anthropological theory or some literary theory, you might recognize some structuralism here. We've got an opposition between the living and the dead. We've got an opposition between perishable materials like wood and durable materials like stone. We have an opposition between light and dark in the terms of the days. And we can imagine, and Parker Pearson certainly does, that there was some ritual reverse of the one that we just tracked through. Some ritual reverse that would have happened in the summer months, in June, when the summer solstice took place. Only at this point, instead of starting in the land of the living at Durrington Walls, Our celebrants likely would have started at Stonehenge itself. And this is certainly not a tradition that died with the Neolithic. On June 21st, you can log into any number of websites and see live streamed a group of neo-druids and other New Age folks arriving at Stonehenge before the dawn hours and celebrating the sunrise there. What they don't necessarily do is progress down the avenue and move back up along the river to Durrington Walls to celebrate life in the living section of the world here. And we can imagine that celebration likely included similar feasts, and probably, if we use other kinds of analysis or analogs, from around the world, probably included things like marriage rituals, a lot of sex to produce the next generation. Thank you, ancestors. And things like family exchanges, adoptions, fosterage, new sorts of agreements about who might use the land during its most fertile periods, right? And so what makes this all possible is a set of alignments at both Stonehenge and Durrington Walls. And Stonehenge has been studied pretty intensively for at least 350 years, and perhaps most intensively from 1800 onward. And so a lot of celestial alignments, that is, alignments with the stars, have been suggested for Stonehenge, for the standing stones themselves at various stages, because we know that the site was erected in a number of phases, for the stones that have fallen, or for sockets for stones that appear to never have been installed, and for more perishable elements like wooden posts that have been postulated to exist at the site. And so, depending on when you're reading and who you're reading, you might find any number of theories about what kinds of calendar Stonehenge makes possible. But the one that we know for certain is this alignment right here. And it is most famously seen on this half of the line, which is labeled here phase 3 axis, that passes through the so-called heel stone and the slaughter stone through to the middle of the site, and would continue parallel to these other two. This is the line of the sunrises and sunsets on the two solstices at either end of the year. And as I said, it is shared by all of the timber circles within and around Durrington Walls. Now, again, we were talking here perhaps at the earliest at about 3000 BCE. And we get our iconic sunset with the little hand, right? I love the guy in the film who's like, "Wah!" Right? So we can imagine that little hand's doing that too. The Neolithic in the British Isles seems to have been very focused on the solstices. And so a few hundred years earlier, what we're looking at here is what's called a passage tomb. It's a large tumulus. It's a massive mound. You can see the modern building in the background for scale. A massive mound with standing stones outside and some smaller installations in Newgrange, which is in County Meath, Ireland. And if anybody is watching right now from Dungarvan, before you head to the airport in Dublin, I suggest that you take just the short trip north to visit Newgrange on the Boyne. Now, in Irish mythology, and this is later Irish mythology, things that come out of the Iron Age and the early medieval period, this is the house of the goddess of the Boyne, of her son, who is a god of beauty and grace and all the things that my Neolithic self might lack. But inside, what's incredibly interesting here is that most of this mound is solid. But there is a passage, a very thin, narrow passage carved into the mound, and you can see it here both in plan view and in profile. So plan view is this top one. If you're looking at it from above, you can see that it's a long passage. Here is the entryway, and each of these is a burial niche, each of these little cruciform things. And then we have it in profile. So in cross-section, you can see that it is vaulted above these burial chambers. And the passage, this is the passage of the passage tomb, it's constructed in such a way that on this winter solstice, at sunrise, light enters through what's called this box lintel, and it is focused in a beam that continues for nearly the entire passage. One can imagine it's illuminating the people who were buried here. And we imagine, again, like at Stonehenge, that these weren't just everyday, ordinary people, that these were probably some important people to this society, and that their subjects or their retainers were likely deposited somewhere nearby, and perhaps that is in the River Boyne. Now, I need to say that, of course, Europe isn't the only place with celestial alignments, but if you will allow me a moment to pause for station identification, I need to let you know that if you are interested in learning more about the European Neolithic, about these landscapes, about celestial alignments, then I suggest that you consider taking Dr. Marianne Owach's class this next fall, called Later European Prehistory. It's a Thursday morning course, and it has no prerequisites, and you're going to cover everything from the end of the Upper Paleolithic, so the end of what's called the Old Stone Age, through the Neolithic, all the way up through the Iron Age, which is what I studied as a graduate student, to the Roman conquest. And these questions about how religion and landscape go together are fundamental questions that interest both Dr. Owach and me. All right, now that I've tried to sell you something other than bathroom wands, we can move on. My departmental colleague, Dr. Wang, talked on Friday evening about sky watching in ancient China and ancient India, going back at least to the 1st century CE. And the use of astronomical information to help ancient astronomers, ancient observers, to understand omens and portents that might have had something to do with, for example, the empire. And a couple of my students have put together a poster, which you can see in the hallway between the Performing Arts Center and Zurn Hall right now. It's sort of just on the outside of the theater exit there, looking at some myths of mostly past cultures related to the sun and the moon and their understandings of the eclipse. And in those myths, you can see that it was really in the best interest of ancient leaders to know when something like an eclipse might happen or when some celestial event was coming down the pike. These were things that were understood to have meaning, meaning that was interpreted through each group's, what we call in anthropology, life world. Now, we can't always reconstruct life worlds, and this is why the theorizing of Parker Pearson, putting together lots of different evidence from Darrington Walls and Stonehenge, is so important. We can imagine that this is one thing that might have been going on there. It's tough for us to know for certain when we're looking archaeologically at exactly what's happening. The record of sky watching in Africa is actually quite long, and in fact, seems to be longer than what we have in Neolithic Britain. So what we're looking at right here is something called a calendar circle, though there have been people who've questioned whether that's an appropriate name for this site. At Nabta Playa in the Nubian desert in what is today southwestern Egypt. You can see It's a group of standing stones on the dune of this playa. And a playa is a dry area that was once probably a lake front. This is not the site itself, and that is important to point out. This is a reconstruction at a nearby museum. This site also dates to the Neolithic, but it's to the Egyptian Neolithic. There is a clear alignment here for those who can recognize such things, once again, to the summer solstice. In this case, the summer solstice would fall very close to the rainy season in this region. And the fact that this is called a playa suggests it's near a place that gathers a lot of water. And in fact, from a very early period, we see a lot of people camping out here. These were likely nomadic herders. If they were herding cattle, cattle take a lot of water. And so the ability to predict when the rainy season was nearing would have been very important. Astrophysicist Thomas Brophy has suggested that some of these stones align to the stars in Orion's belt. And based on computer projections of their historical locations, the stars of the belt, he estimates that this site was erected sometime between 6400 and 4900 BCE. So we're talking at least 1900 years and perhaps significantly more before the erection of Stonehenge. And this is a time period that does match the radiocarbon dating from nearby campsites. More recent publications by archaeologists do call the dating into question somewhat, but admit that Brophy is not wrong, that there do seem to be alignments with Orion's belt, as well as with the stars Sirius, Arcturus, and perhaps Alpha Centauri. And these archaeologists suggest a construction between 4500 and about 3600 BCE. So we're still talking about a construction date before Newgrange or Stonehenge. And we know that this is not the end of sky watching in Africa. So we have quite a bit of evidence in the Egyptian corpus, the sort of pharaonic Egyptian corpus, and certainly by the medieval period, the learning center at Timbuktu. If you didn't know, Timbuktu was a real place, it really was. It was located in what is today Mali, and it became an important, what we would think of today as a university center. And the learning center in Timbuktu had libraries that contained scrolls and books written in multiple languages, Arabic being the sort of later lingua franca of the area, but in multiple African languages, describing centuries of sky watching and calculations based on those observations. If we skip over to the Americas, we're just going to jump across an ocean really fast. I had you already, imagine 5,000 years of distance, so why not a few thousand miles? If we skip over to the Americas, down here in South America, an area called the Pedra Pintada area, and here on your right, you can see that is in fact the Pedra Pintada. Those of you who speak Spanish or Portuguese likely recognize that this place name means painted rock. And the Pedra Pintada itself is part of an entire landscape of rocky outcrops in what was once dense jungle. And these outcrops contain a number of cave sites, like the very well-known Caverna da Pedra Pintada, which really just means painted rock cave, which contain some of the oldest, what would have been just 20 years ago, some of the oldest known evidence of human occupation in the Americas at about 13,000 BCE. Recent discoveries have pushed the age of humans in the Americas back quite a bit further. But for quite some time, this was a relatively controversial date. And the caverna, as well as other caves in the area and open cliff faces, have what are called petroglyphs. So petroglyphs mean pictures on rock. In this case, they are painted pictures. And one nearby site is the Painel do Pilau. And on the Painel do Pilão, we have sunburst images. We have a number of these images that seem kind of like human forms. They call them lollipop images. And the orientations of the lollipops all seem to fall along the same azimuth or same angle. And throughout all of these images, there are also very clear human images. There are very clear animal images. There are images that blend humans and animals. But especially at the Painel do Pilão, which is a very long, high, open wall, we see a lot of celestial imagery, a lot of spirals, a lot of sun signs, and then these kind of strange Xbox things, which have been found elsewhere in Brazil as well. The excavators of this site suggest that what you're looking at here is a calendar that has some counts of important celestial events. And at either end of the long wall, there are solar symbols that would seem to imply a solstice. And in fact, at one end, and I apologize, I did not pull a picture of this, at one end, there is a view of another rock in the distance that has two promontories and then a notch. So if you've ever fired a rifle, it looks kind of like the end sight of your gun. Excuse me, the end closest to you of your gun, right, that you try to get the bead into. And the solstice will tend to fall along that site in such a way that you actually have about 20 days of warning before the solstice and 20 days of warning after the solstice of when it will happen. And it's important to note that this would have been one of the only views of the sky available climbing up onto this, this outcrop for people in a very dense jungle. And this is a very dense jungle in a place that doesn't have a lot of seasonality, where the seasons don't change very much. And so the best way to measure the change in seasons is to watch what's happening in the sky. Skipping again a few thousand miles, this time we're going to go north. In the Chaco Canyon complex in what is today New Mexico, we have maybe one of the most complex combinations of celestial alignments built into an entire landscape, maybe even more complex than the Durrington Walls and Stonehenge situation. Here we're looking at ancestral Puebloan culture. Some of you who've taken archaeology classes may have learned about the Anasazi. And here, this area was built up between 850 CE and 1250. And although it's a bit small, if you were to look at this map and, really closely, you would see that there are sites that are constructed within the valley that are almost perfectly east-west of one another, and other sites that are almost perfectly north-south of one another. There is, I don't think it's shown on this map, but there is what's called a Great Northern Road that connects Chaco Canyon to other Chacoan sites elsewhere in what is now New Mexico and perhaps even into Colorado. And that road is almost bullet straight north-south. Down here, there is a set of petroglyphs. In this case, rather than painted, many of them are pecked off out of the surface. And in fact, there are petroglyphs all along the bluffs and buttes above these settlements. One of them, though, that stands out is down here at Fajada Butte, which was down in the southeastern section of the river valley. And high up on Fajada Butte, there is a petroglyph that has been called the Sun Dagger. And so you can see it here in the upper left corner. It is a spiral that is pecked into the rock face. And the surrounding rocks are situated in such a way that, you guessed it, we're looking at another solstice marker. On the summer solstice, this dagger, this thin line of light, crosses immediately over the center of the spiral here. And this is not the only solar or lunar petroglyph in the valley. And the idea is that there were people up in the hills, perhaps even stationed up there for long periods of time. Imagine lonely forest rangers out, on fire towers, watching what's happening in the world below. But stationed here for long periods of time, watching the stars. And the people of Chaco then built those alignments into their structures. The middle picture here shows you one of the better known structures of Chaco Canyon. This is a place called Pueblo Bonito. And it looks small, but I'm here to tell you this is a massive city. And this city is actually shown to you here. The long axis is the east-west axis. And so it is more or less a large D pointing to the north. This is the north-south line, and it is near perfect. This line also tends to follow the sunrises and sunsets on an east-west line. And in fact, while in ancestral Puebloan homes, windows are very common, what is not common is to have a window in a corner. You might imagine a window in a corner is not a very practical element to a home. This particular corner window is in the southeastern corner of the site. It is not in the immediate outside wall, but one tier in. And it has been theorized and observed at this point that this window provides a very clear view of the winter solstice sunrise. And again, just like the passage tomb at Newgrange, a beam of light on the winter solstice enters through this window. There is a problem because it's in the second tier of buildings. There is a possibility that the outside tier of buildings would have blocked it. So at this point, perhaps it is coincidence. But given the way that these sites are built in the broader landscape and the care taken at Pueblo Bonito to establish clear alignments, it seems likely that, in fact, we're looking here at another intentional celestial alignment. And we find this at lots of places in the Americas. So if we skip over to the Mississippi Valley, we have Cahokia, which was perhaps one of the largest cities of, certainly of the ancient Americas, and would rival some of the cities of the ancient world for its population in the tens of thousands, all built, just so you know, all built on the labor of women growing crops like sunflowers and squash and a bunch of weeds that today we think of as ditch weeds, right? So this is before the introduction of corn. Cahokia is just across the river from present-day St. Louis, Missouri, and it also seems to show us a series of astronomical observations. What you can't quite see in this image, other than just one little tip, there's a circle of posts here. There is a timber circle, also has been called America's woodhenge, that seems to be calendrical. It aligns to solstices and a few other celestial events. But here, as at Pueblo Bonito, the entire city also has an alignment. The entire city sits at an angle of about 5 degrees off north and south. And at first, that really confused the recent investigators at Cahokia until they realized that the intersection of a series of solar and lunar events produces a rectangle that lays roughly 5 degrees off north and south. So what I hope to have shown you with each of these sites is that there is some accuracy to the astronomical observation of past peoples. And beyond that, the way that you get accuracy is through long-term, careful observation and recording in some manner. Now, what these things meant, we cannot necessarily know. So the why question becomes important. Quite often, we have records of stories that we would think of as philosophical or religious or mythological to associate with these kinds of sites. and these kinds of observation. And for those of us who are interested in what science is and what science means, the mythological might be challenging. But for people living in the past, including the past of our Western culture, that barrier between religion and science was much more permeable than American society in 2024 allows. And so these sites might be capturing some image of the cosmos in the earthly microcosm. They might be doing this at multiple scales, and they might be doing it out of some concern for a god who is the sun, or a goddess who is the moon, or in the Inuit example that my students present in the other building, for a goddess who is the sun and a god who is the moon. They might also very well be doing this to help them understand the movements of animals and plants, whether they are hunting and gathering those animals and plants, or whether they are herding and growing those animals and plants. So calendrics become extremely important, and the best way to figure them out is to watch what's happening in the sky. Perhaps most important here, in terms of recognizing this as indigenous science, and we're at a point in anthropology and related disciplines where we can talk about indigenous science. We can talk about complex herbal remedies, sometimes that result from synergistic effects of multiple parts that, if not put together in just the right way, won't work. We can talk about the domestication processes that led to most of the food that we eat today. In fact, a vast majority of those domestication processes happened in the Americas. So if you love potatoes and tomatoes and peppers and I don't know, turkey, go out and hug your closest Native American, because you know, their ancestors brought those things to us. We might not always ascribe something like astronomy or mathematics to these indigenous people, but these sites and the many others like them that exist show us that there was something very complex, very scientific, based on long-term observation and recording that was happening. And that long-term observation and recording allowed people to do things like build in stone in ways that would continue to be true to the original observations, and to make informed projections of future events. If we skip down to Central America, and especially to the Maya area, which is kind of eastern Mexico, down through the south, through Belize and Guatemala, all the way Honduras to Nicaragua. There is quite a bit of written material on buildings, quite a lot less written material in books, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But when we try to understand the eclipse, for example, we have to understand that in Maya cosmology, much of what is happening in the sky is because of the action of a god named Kinich Ahau. And Kinich Ahau is associated with the sun. He spends his day moving across the sky, and at night, he takes a very dangerous passage through the Maya underworld of Xibalba. And it's always a little risky that Kinich Ahau will not emerge from Xibalba. And so every sunrise is important. When an eclipse occurs, for traditional Maya people, it signals a weakening of Kinich Ahau. And that weakening doesn't necessarily produce anxieties about the power of the moon, but rather about the power of the morning star, of a god named Chak-ek. And the morning star is the planet Venus. Some of you might know that the planet Venus at various points in the day seems to closely approach the sun or the moon, and it is possible sometimes during an eclipse, when there is nothing else visible in the sky, to see a very bright Venus approaching the eclipse. And so there came to be, for Maya rulers, as for other rulers of Mesoamerica, we can imagine, some premium put on understanding the movements of Kinich Ahau and of Chak Ik. Now, I said we don't have a lot of written material in books. And this is not the result of a pre-literate or illiterate population. In fact, the peoples of Mexico and Central America were extremely literate at the moment of European contact. And this flies in the face of a lot of understandings of American Indian cultures that I was taught, for example. They had books that were made on animal skins as well as books made on bark. And thanks to a number of quote-unquote acts of faith by early Spanish missionaries, the majority of these books, several centuries worth of cultural memory, were burned or otherwise destroyed. And I'm here to tell you that there are perhaps only 4 or 5 known remains of these books. And they are so few that they are named. And so what we're looking at on the left side here is a section of the Codex Borgia. And the Codex Borgia actually is interesting because although found in a Maya context, the artwork is slightly different, the references are slightly different, the iconographic references are slightly different, and it seems like it might have come from central Mexico rather than the Maya area. But like other iconography in the Maya area, including on temples, an important part of the Codex Borgia traces the movements of Venus, of Chak Ik, who's associated quite a lot with warfare and chaos. On the right, we have about, 6 pages of a bark folded book called the Dresden Codex, because it now lives in Dresden, in Germany, from about the 12th or 13th century. And these 6 pages show us a few different things. On the sort of leftmost portion of them, we're seeing, tracing the sun's movements, the movements of Kinich Ahau, and even an eclipse prediction near the end. And if you see a lot of these things, these bars and dots, these are numbers. And the bars and dots were fundamental to our initial translations of Maya writing. In the middle, this is maybe like it feels like a kid's school book because it is a set of multiplication tables. And then at the end, there is a flood prediction. And that flood prediction may have been made based on observations of the landscape. It may also have been made based on what we would think of today as astrological or omenological observations of the movements of celestial bodies. And so we have in these 2 codices evidence that Maya scholars and other members perhaps of Mesoamerican communities of the pre-Columbian past had both the ability and the inclination to use their scientific observations to make predictions, and sometimes quite complicated predictions about when various kinds of celestial event might happen, and to derive meaning from those events. Just to recap, today I introduced you to some of the evidence for careful long-term sky watching by the members of past societies. I suggested that these historical sky watchers were actually astronomers and that we should speak of them as such, practicing a form of indigenous science, one of many. And I have provided just the briefest glimpse of eclipse prediction in at least one past society. I would not be surprised to learn that there are many, many others, and I encourage you to go out and look for them. Thank you for your attention today. We don't have a lot of time, but I would take a question or two if you have them. Stephen. No, excuse me, Nate. Go ahead.
Hey, I have a big question, though.
Yeah.
Is there any art that people like really nice faces?
Yeah.